Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The 7 Deadly Sins of White Christian Nationalism, A Call to Action, by Carter Heyward, narrated by Rosemary Benson. Dedicated to Rob, Isabel, Kate, Cooper, Ramsey, Katie, nephews, nieces, goddess children, one and all. You are a light. You are the light. Never let anyone, any person, or any force dampen, dim, or diminish your light. Release the need to hate, to harbor division, and the enticement of revenge. Release all bitterness. Hold only love, only peace in your heart, knowing that the battle of good to overcome evil is already won. John Lewis. Across That Bridge, Life Lessons and a Vision for Change. Preface. I'm a politically progressive, white Christian American woman in my late 70s, and I write urgently to those with ears to hear. Listen up, my friends. An Episcopal priest who identifies these days as a Universalist Christian, I have written, taught, preached, and spoken publicly as a lesbian feminist theologian for most of the last 50 years. This book, from my perspective, is far and away the most important piece I have ever done. I am writing primarily to American Christians. Those who are neither American nor Christian might find portions of the book engaging and even helpful, and I urge you to give it a try. I am writing to the white Protestant Christians, though Roman Catholics and Orthodox Christians in America might recognize themselves here, and Black and Christians of color may find this book rings true to some of their experiences of white Christianity, and surely to large chunks of their experiences of America. The book is also intended largely for those who are moderate to progressive in their politics and spiritualities. Whether we are Democrats, Republicans, independents, unaffiliated, participants in other parties, active in no party, or generally uninterested in politics, I am calling you to join in helping to preserve, protect, and defend our most cherished value, the love of God and of our neighbors, a love that generates justice, freedom, and compassion for all. This book is a call to action, a call for American Christians to get involved, to do whatever we can, each and all of us, to make justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Amos chapter 5, verse 24, New Revised Standard Version. The moral challenges and political hurdles we face in today's America have been simmering and bubbling here and there throughout our history as a nation. Nothing that we are witnessing in the 21st century is new. In the past several years, however, our problems have come to a boil. Today, they threaten to destroy the constitutional foundations of our democratic republic and turn us into an authoritarian nation that most Americans and most Christians would come to despise, regardless of how conservative, moderate, or progressive we may be in our politics or our faith. If we love a God of justice and compassion, if we aspire to walk with Jesus as an advocate of friend and stranger alike, and if we wish to be a servant of the public good, the well-being of all, we must learn how to stand together and be strategic in doing so. For most of us, this means supporting a political party that can win, not casting protest votes, much less sitting out upcoming elections at national, state, or local levels. It will take us all to turn things around, which we must if we value both the constitutional foundations of our country and the basis of our religious faith. This book is based on a premise that Christians have particular roles to play in this process because, regardless of whether we are more liberal or conservative, Christianity has played a foundational role in American history. Much of American Christianity's role has been for good. Everything churches have contributed to making a nation of liberty and justice for all has been excellent. But much of Christianity's part in forging American history has been more problematic. The 7 deadly sins of white Christian nationalism that are named and explored in this book have distorted the American dream by thwarting, again and again, the movements among people to generate liberty and justice, truly for all of us, not just some of us. As we walk a perilous path in today's America, Christians need to be mindful of a terrible moral and political threat to our country. Christo-fascism is a seductive form of authoritarianism taking shape among us in the guise of Christian faith and all American values, especially the value of liberty, or freedom, even at the expense of the common good. The great German Christian theologian Dorothee Sölle coined the term Christo-fascism in the early 1980s while she was teaching theology at Union Seminary in New York City. Recalling her German homeland in the 1930s and 1940s, Sölle recognized in Ronald Reagan's America the seeds of something familiar. Digging from her past, she named as Christo-fascist the dangers she detected in Reagan's America First foreign policy, which was being built on stealth and lies. Sölle noticed that this expansionist foreign policy was being funded and bolstered at home by a trickle-down economics designed to increase the wealth of rich white Christian American males. She saw that trickle-down economics were not working. The rich were getting richer, and the poor were getting poorer. She saw that much like Hitler's regime had crafted its Aryan supremacism, anti-Semitism, misogyny, and military expansionism, the Reagan administration was waging domestic and internal violence against Black Americans, gay men, feminist women, and others deemed either dangerous or useless to building the greatest nation on earth. And Sölle saw also that Reagan and his lionizing of rich people in America was being supported enthusiastically, not only by rich people, but also by less rich, even poor white Christians who were aspiring to make it in America, desperate to survive the very conditions that were resulting from trickle-down Reaganomics. All the while, these middle, working, and poorer-class Americans were being assured by their spiritual leaders, mainly conservative Christian evangelists, that upward mobility, spiritually and economically, was God's will for the patriotic faithful in a reliably white Christian nation. In the decades since the Reagan administration, many white American Christians have continued to be seduced by religious, business, and political leaders to vote against their own economic interests. In matters of economic justice, Christianity, capitalism, and the GOP have conspired as a most unholy trinity in the upper tiers of American power. Sölle realized and warned that such unholiness and seduction of the masses in the name of God of rich white Christian men is exactly what fascist leaders did in Germany in the 1930s. Indeed, this is happening again today in Europe and other parts of the world, including the United States of America. America for short in this book. The unholy trinity of business, religious, and political interests presents us not only with an American problem, but also a uniquely Christian challenge, because our churches have allowed a latent authoritarianism in both church and state to fester theologically among us from the time of our origins as a nation. This has been especially the case since the Second World War, from which the United States of America emerged victorious. Our nation quickly became not only a rich and proud nation, but the richest and proudest nation on the planet. A nation whose wealth and power has deep roots in white supremacy, misogyny, capitalist spirituality, and the other sources of evil named in this book as the 7 deadly sins of white Christian nationalism. This book explores these sins and calls us all, especially those of us who are Christians and Americans, to some urgent moral work of spiritual renewal and social transformation. Can America be made great again? Or, in some ways, deeply good and thereby great for the first time? It's up to us. Carter Heyward, January 2022. Part 1. In the Beginning. Chapter 1. Why this book? The fathers have eaten sour grapes, and the children's teeth are set on edge. Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 29, English Standard Version. Soon after the insurrection at the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021, this book began to take shape. My family and friends had been stunned as we watched hundreds of rioters, their makeshift gallows rising above them, attack both the Capitol itself and those there to protect it. We had watched in dismay as video showed the torture of police officers, and how close the insurrectionists had come to breaching the chambers of a sitting Congress. With the rest of the nation and much of the world, we had witnessed insurrectionists carrying Confederate flags alongside wooden crosses, wearing Camp Auschwitz staff sweatshirts, and wrapping their arms around copies of the Bible. We had seen angry men draped in Trump flags, bowing in front of a cross. We had been shocked as this mob smashed windows, yelled obscenities, destroyed the camera equipment of journalists, formed nooses from the cords, and yelled, "Hang Mike Pence," all in an attempt to overturn the 2020 election results. We had watched in disbelief at the flaunting in real time of white supremacy and other death-dealing dynamics of hate in front of and inside the U.S. Capitol, which Abraham Lincoln had named the People's House. Later we learned that some of the rioters had defecated inside legislative chambers. Nearly all of the insurrectionists were white, which no doubt helped them live long enough to have their murderous rampage downplayed by a former president and his political party. Trump's people hope that most Americans and most Christians will simply move on and not hold it against the grand old party, which in this historical moment is composed largely of white Christian men and the women who play along with them. And make no mistake, the January 6th attack was a Christian affair. As Jeffrey Goldberg reported in The Atlantic, the conflation of Trump and Jesus was a common theme at the rally. Goldberg discussed a moment of exchange he had with an insurrectionist from Texas, noting that the violence was beyond what could be explained through the prism of politics, but was psychological, theological, and eschatological. The man, Goldberg reported, believed this attack was part of the end times. "It's all in the Bible," he told Goldberg. "Everything is predicted. Donald Trump is in the Bible. Get yourselves ready." This man was not alone in his cult-like devotion. Witnessing neo-Nazis, Proud Boys, and other hate groups lie, destroy property, and torture others in the name of Jesus, many of us knew deep in our bones that this moment was not an anomaly in U.S. history. We realized that its violence has roots deep in our national story. We also knew that the groups attacking the Capitol, like hate groups before them, were relying on most Americans and most Christians to provide them with legitimacy, either by trivializing or shunning any connection with and responsibility for the insurrection. Furthermore, as research in the months after the attack has shown, many of the insurrectionists were not members of hate groups, but were just average, mainstream American citizens. This has led commentators to raise concerns about how extremist ideologies have moved increasingly into the mainstream. The dramatic display of the large cross in the midst of this pageant of scorn and terror has been impossible to miss. We had watched this drama unfold in the name of the Christian God. As Anthea Butler wrote, these evangelicals were not naive individuals who were taken advantage of by a slick New York real estate mogul and reality TV star. They were his accomplices. The time had come for other Christians to speak out, not only on behalf of this nation, but more importantly, on behalf of a God of justice, love, and peace. What about Americans who aren't Christian and Christians who aren't American? Why should anyone who isn't a Christian, or perhaps even an American, have any interest in a book that focuses almost entirely on being both Christian and American? People of other spiritual traditions, or none at all, and people from other countries might well read this book and ponder how it may also reflect how their religious tradition or philosophy has been shaped by similar dynamics to those we name as foundational to white Christian nationalism. For example, to what extent are American Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, pagans, or people of other traditions being co-opted and conditioned by what is named in this book as the sins of white Christian nationalism? How might Christians in Australia, South Africa, Brazil, and South Korea, for instance, experience their own political cultures as being shaped by one or more of the same or similar 7 deadly sins of white Christian nationalism? Perhaps you will need to consider sins or simply failures in your own religious or national cultures. If you are American but not Christian, it still might behoove you to understand a bit more about how the underbelly of your country, in many ways, has been formed by the sins of white Christian nationalism. People who are neither Christian nor American may or may not resonate with the Christian feminist foundations and questions I raise, as they are shaped explicitly around liberative interpretations of Scripture for Christians in America today. But here in parts 1 and 2, you might see yourselves, your religious traditions and practices, as well as sharpen your senses of the insidious nationalism that is creeping around the world. For neither Christianity nor America has a monopoly on the social dynamics that generate evil. Points of personal entry as a white Southern Christian woman. This rest of this chapter is a highly personal reflection on how my interest in matters of white Christian nationalism has been forged in the course of my life. I am including this material not because my personal journey is any more engaging than yours, but rather to spark you to think about how your own experiences have been influenced by the dynamics of white Christian nationalism. Our lives, after all, provide the basis of our politics, as well as our spiritualities. The more boldly we share our stories, the more we are encouraging others to do likewise. The more honestly we share our values and our concerns, the better able we become to envision some significant reformations of our nation and of our Christian lives. This book is a call to such reformation. In this spirit, I urge you to listen to this chapter with an interest not only in my life, but also your own. Take mental notes as you go. Stop and think. Talk with a good friend. How have events in your life helped create your identity, your values, and how you view the current state of both the United States of America and the Christian Church, or whatever your religious or spiritual community may be? Talk to each other and tell the truth. Talk about race. It never crossed my mind growing up that the church I loved was not just part of the problem, but a major part of the problem of white supremacy in America. As a white Southern Christian girl child, growing up in a home in Charlotte, North Carolina, the context is important, where both parents conveyed a moderately open but still traditional Southern and Christian view of race relations, I suppose I was rather precocious to raise questions at home about white privilege. Not in that language, of course. I asked my parents why it was that Bessie, the black woman who helped take care of me, lived in another part of town, in a tiny house that didn't look as nice as our small frame house in a working and lower middle class white neighborhood. I don't recall their answer. And I was baffled at age 4 or 5 when Bessie walked away from me and our house and never came back in response to my having been singing the jingle, "Eeny, meeny, miny, mo, catch an N-word by his toe," while jumping rope with my best friend, another little white girl. My parents were shocked when I told them, and for the first time, they told me that people like us, meaning nice white people, never, ever used the N-word because it was cruel and unkind. Why, then, I asked, does God allow white people to treat colored people in cruel and unkind ways? Why? Why? I was one of those kids who always wanted to know why. To the best of my memory, Daddy said something like, "Sugar plum, God doesn't like it. God doesn't want white people to be cruel to colored people." I must have pressed on. Well, why don't we do something about it? I think I recall my parents hugging me, but I also have a fuzzy memory of them looking at each other and shaking their heads. The message I got, whether or not spoken, was that there was nothing we could do, and that we ought to be sorry about it. And I was. Sorry, sad, and puzzled. Talk about gender. Meanwhile, up in the apple tree in our side yard, I was having regular chats with my imaginary playmate, Sophie Couch, a colored girl my age who was just as concerned as I was about not only race relations, but also what we girls could be and do when we grew up. Girls, not boys. Sophie was the first feminist voice in my life. Of course, she was my own better angel, my own little reservoir of wisdom. Why does a child concoct an imaginary friend in the first place? Probably because she needs someone to talk to, someone who understands her, another kid, somebody like her, more or less. Until recently, I hadn't given much thought to how Sophie Couch's blackness was shaping my female consciousness. And yes, I do believe that Sophie was, in fact, an inspired level of my consciousness as a girl child, and that she reflected some colored wisdom trying to reach, teach, and stretch my little white girl awareness of what was what. Not that I could be or become black, but that I could and should begin to reflect on race as well as gender, and think about racism and sexism, and incorporate lessons from people of color into my white privileged life, even as a female, and even as a child. Talk about class. Then there was the matter of class. Perhaps the most baffling matter of all for most Americans and most Christians in America. I was a white girl child in a muddled middle or working middle-class Christian family. Who knows what class my family was? They certainly didn't. They spoke of themselves as upper middle class, but I came to realize years later, as an adult, that in terms of class, my parents were more aspirational than realistic. We were, I believe, plain old middle-class white people in the mountains of North Carolina. Later in this book, we will be highlighting capitalist spirituality as a significant problem among Christians in America. As a child, I knew nothing firsthand about social or economic class because I was never hungry, homeless, or without access to health care or good public education. My father had picked cotton on a farm in South Carolina, where his father was the manager of a mill. Later, Daddy played shortstop on a minor league baseball team before joining the Army and serving in the Pacific during World War II. Mama had been born into a fairly prominent family in Charlotte, North Carolina, where her father had owned a wholesale tobacco company and her mother had belonged to various ladies' clubs and cotillions. Bob Heyward and Mary Ann Carter met on a blind date during one of Daddy's leaves in 1943. They married on another such leave in 1944, and I was born in 1945. At the end of the war, my father took a job as a salesman for Esso, later Exxon, oil, and my mother was a homemaker. As their first of 3 children, I was the apple of their eyes, they would each tell me, and I never had any reason to doubt that I was a most beloved little girl. When I was a child, my 2 great passions were for animals and God, probably in that order. Talk about animals. Early on, I knew beyond any doubt in my little girl mind-body-spirit that the giant spirit man, very old and very white, who everyone called God, had as much to do with the box turtle and black snake in the yard as with any human being. I've already mentioned my colored playmate Sophie Couch as one of the first God-bearers into my consciousness and deepest sense of self. I say one of, because as far back as I can remember, it was the animals, not only our dogs, but also turtles, snakes, frogs, crawfish in the creek that ran behind the house, hoot owls, robin redbreasts, and bluebirds who godded for me. Filled with God, they became conduits of the sacred. I don't recall any lessons from the animals about race or gender. Those lessons came first and foremost from my own imagination in the form of Sophie Couch. As Sister Angela, an Anglican nun, priest, and beloved friend, would ask me 50 years later, as we sat together over tea in a tree house in her monastery in the Australian bush, "What is imagination, darling, if not a window into God?" Was it God who was teaching me about race and gender through my imaginary playmate? Was Sophie Couch my most direct line to God? My parents, Bob and Mary Ann, who I believe never contradicted Sophie, also taught me explicitly about gender and race, though it was a little later. I was probably 6 or 7 when I began to hear from my parents about what girls could and could not do. For example, girls could not be priests, they said, because girls were the wrong sex. Gender was called sex in those days, and sex was not spoken of in our home, regardless. Talk about abuse and violence. When, at about age 5, I was molested, touched inappropriately, not raped or hurt, by Jeff the yard man, everybody freaked out, especially Police Chief K, who shot several times over Jeff's head, making him run for his life, and yelling, "If you ever come back into this county, you'll be one dead N-word."
Sample complete. Ready to continue?